debates within the church by a priest and then reformer Martin Luther. Since the Protestant Reformation is 501 years ago, Protestants have talked a lot about the verb believe and the noun faith. I believe, or we believe, stands at the very beginning of all of our creeds and are the central confession of faith that the confirmands will be making today about themselves. We believe. The 16th century Reformation emphasized that our relationship to God is primarily about faith. We are saved by faith, we say, not by works. In other words, it's God's work, not ours. Ever since then, our church has spoken of believing and faith as foundational to our understanding of what it means to be a Christian. But the common meaning of these words in the modern era, in modern English, has taken on quite a different understanding from their pre-modern and ancient Christians' original intention. When I ask people, and if I asked you about your understanding of the word believe, I would hear these sorts of statements. I ask these questions. Some have said, there are some things that you can know, and other things that you just have to believe. Do you hear the definition in there? Quote, I use the word believe when I'm not sure. Like if you asked me, what was the capital of Kansas? And if I can't really remember whether it's Wichita or Topeka, I might say, well, I believe it's Topeka, but I wouldn't be sure. Or when I say, I believe you to someone, another person said, it means that I believe that they're telling me the truth in this instance. Or sometimes, the person said, I use it when talking about an unknown future, like, well, I believe the weather will be nice tomorrow. These responses suggest that knowing and believing are two completely different things. It's like believing is what you turn to when your knowledge runs out. Or believing reflects some kind of uncertainty or tentativeness. Well, I believe it might be sunny tomorrow in Southern California. That's pretty good probability. It's more like probability than knowing. Even religious people get in on this modern understanding of the word believing. Like believing is what you do when the Bible says things that we don't find credible, like a 7-day creation story or a virgin birth or miraculous stories. And so we turn to believing, separating it from knowing, or it's to turn to believing as a consolation for believing in God, even though reasons for doing so don't seem very conclusive. And so we go to a backup plan called belief. All of our modern understandings of believing the word, and I looked at almost every dictionary I could find, define it as believing that. Believing that. Believing that something or that a statement is true with varying degrees of certainty. The modern meaning of believe is very different from its underpinning, where it came from in Christian history before 1600. Prior to 1600, in English, the verb believe always had a person as the object of it, not a true or false statement, which is how we mean it today, with varying degrees of uncertainty and certainty, but more like what it means to say when you say to someone, I believe in you, which is kind of different to say, I believe in you, than to say, I believe you. To believe in someone is very different than believing something they've said. It means having confidence in a person, trusting a person. And in a Christian context, it means having confidence in God and Jesus, trusting God and Jesus. In fact, before 1600, the word believe in Old English was below. Think about what it sounds like. It means to hold dear. Is that your definition of what you think believe means? Below. The word below has an obvious modern similarity to the word beloved. In the Old English understanding, to believe was not meant to have confidence or trust in the veracity of a statement of a person that was making, but it was to hold that person dear. How different of an understanding that is of the word believe. To beloved a person. Believing and beloving are the same idea in Old English. So prior to 1600s, to believe in God and Jesus meant to beloved God and Jesus. Think of how different that meaning is for what we think about what we mean when we say, I believe something. To believe in God does not mean believing in a set of statements or doctrines or documents, that God is true or false, but it means to be invited into relationship with, the opportunity to beloved. Now, this meaning goes back to ancient Christianity, too. The Latin root of the word credo, which is the center of our action today in our confirmation, is to pronounce a creed or make a confession of faith, means I believe. But literally, credo means I give my heart to. Now think about that. If we started our creed instead of I believe in God the Father Almighty, we would say I give my heart to God the Father. Is that two different statements? I would think it is. Heart here is not really the center organ in our chest or even the center of our feelings, which is what it means, but in an ancient understanding was the sense of the whole self, the deepest possible self, beneath our thinking, our willing, our feeling. Wow. Can you imagine starting our creeds with that? From the depth of myself. From the depth of myself, I give my heart to God. So this difference goes even deeper. It's deeper even than our creedal formulas, which were 4th century. It's also in the Bible. A few weeks ago, we did a series on James, doers of the word do. James chapter 2, verse 7 says this. James said, you believe in God who is one, and that you do well at. But even the demons believe that and shudder. In other words, even the demons believe God is one, but they do not beloved God. They believe, but don't beloved. It goes even deeper than the New Testament. Jesus said things about believing, but he never said, you shall believe in these statements that they're true about God. Instead, Jesus, quoting the Hebrew Bible, said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind and soul and strength. And of course, he was quoting from Deuteronomy chapter 6, the Torah. For Christianity and its Jewish roots, believing is beloving, is loving God, even if God is beyond understanding. And this is hard, but you know people who separate these things. They may not understand that they separate these things, but who among us has a friend who has lost someone and they blame God for the loss? That is ironclad knowing, right? That kind of theology that God is to blame is a knowing, but it is not a beloving. It is to hold God responsible without loving God at the same time. We've done the same sort of thing with the word faith, especially Lutherans. We've so handled faith, you can hardly see it from the mud that we've put on the word. Today, if you ask a person, are you a person of faith? You are meaning, are you a Muslim? Are you Jewish? Are you Christian? Are you religious? That's what you're asking. Are you a person of faith? Almost all definitions, and I looked it up again, do the same thing, equating faith with a set of principles or doctrines. But the ancient understanding of faith came from a Latin root word that is fidelius or fiducia. For those of you in the financial area, you know some of these words. Fidelius means fidelity or faithfulness. Think of what that means then in relational terms. Because both of these terms are relational, they're not principled or doctrinal. They're principles. Faithfulness would be far more understood more widely than sexual fidelity, but to express it in a positive kind of way in relationship to our commitment, our loyalty, our allegiance, and our attentiveness to a relationship. So it is with our relationship with God. Faith as fidelity does not mean simply not chasing after other gods, but a commitment, a loyalty, an allegiance, an attentiveness to our relationship with God. Fiducia is a word in Latin that means trust. Faith in God is more than believing a set of principles. It's more than intellectual assent. It's more like trusting in a relationship. Can you know everything about a relationship? Even your most intimate relationships? Do you know absolutely everything? Be careful. No. But you can know enough to trust the person. You can trust the relationship with them. The opposite of fiducia or faith is not infidelity, but mistrust. Think about how this works in your relationships. It's not unfaithfulness that usually is the killer. It's the lack of trust, right? That begins to erode first around the edges, and then it finds sort of an artery, and it goes to some of the main stuff, and it begins to erode the relationship. And where there is mistrust, there's an anxiety, right? And Jesus speaks about this anxiety in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, look at the birds of the air, or look at the lilies of the field. And he says, no one is arrayed in splendor like these. No one feeds the birds, and yet the birds flourish because God cares for them all. A relationship of trust. In this way, Jesus says, God is trustworthy for your care, so cast aside your anxiety and trust him. Come into the sphere of relationship. Think of how differently your life would be if you could trust that relationship with God, that the anxiety would ease out of your life. Think about how different faith as fidelity and trust is from faith as believing a set of principles or statements that somebody else has given you to believe. Belief in the truth of statements won't do a thing about your anxiety, really. But trust in the God to whom your heart is set will be transformative. Faith as fiducia is trusting the buoyancy of God. The philosopher Kierkegaard, for our confirmands, you will hear a lot about him in college. He said that faith is like floating in 70,000 fathoms of water. Just to give you some context, there's no ocean that is as deep as 70,000 fathoms of water. So this is an awful lot of water. And the point is clear. If we're afraid and we struggle as we're on the top of 70,000 fathoms of water, we will sink and drown. We'll exhaust ourselves. But if we trust that the water will keep us up, we will float. Faith as fiducia, as trusting in the buoyancy of God. Now, we torture our confirmands, and we make them go for 3 years, which is just more than most people, 90 sessions, and at the end, we even go further by making them write a paper about this experience, and we cut it by one question, but I think it became harder somehow this year, and all of them have to write about their faith and their family, and then answer sort of specific questions about things of the faith. And each of them, in their own ways, has written about doubt and insecurity in statements of faith. They're not certain about certain facts about God or about the Bible or about the church. Anybody certain about all ideas about God and about faith and about the Bible and about the church? Is there anybody in here that's ironclad certain? No one? No true believers? Yeah, not even in the pulpit. So, you're in great company with all these writings that you have given. And almost everyone in the room shares these kind of edges of doubts and uncertainties and statements about God that are so often thrust at us from the media and from evangelical kind of radio orthodoxy and even from this pulpit or reading the Bible. When we use our modern understanding of believing in faith, you and some of your teachers will rightly limit the scope of the truth of faith if you only see it as evidence instead of stretching faith towards trust. Believing and faith are truths about where you put yourself, your heart, your deepest self, and how you trust even in the circumstances of life when it feels like there's a fathomless anxiety underneath your life. Faith bids us to put your whole self not towards statements about God, but in relationship to a personal, though transcendent mystery, trusting that God has held people throughout history in this fathomless depth of human experience, and that God will hold you too. Faith bids you to relax and trust, even if you don't and won't know everything for certain. And you'll be bobbing along in this life on the buoyancy of God's goodness and grace. It's been an honor to be one of the teachers of this confirmation class, because you have done more than most other classes what we are supposed to do, which is engage the questions. I know you came into class thinking you'd come out with all these answers, but the pride of it is you came out with better questions. You realize there are no easy answers, but you also realize that you're invited into a relationship of trust. So even in our doubts, we put our hearts, our deepest self, into the hands of God. So let us now affirm the promises that your parents made at baptism, bobbing along on their own journey of uncertainty about what this infant life would look like when they were bringing you to the font, and they were promising to raise you in holy questions and the sacred mystery. May you join in these holy questions. May you be grasped by this holy mystery and find yourself beloved and beloving. Amen.